Hello YouTube and welcome to this tutorial on refreshing the cache in plugins and workflows. So this tutorial builds on the previous video on how to set up the cache in the first place. So if you haven't already seen that video, then I've left a link in the description below. It is worth watching that as we'll be building on that video in this one. So in that video we talked about the benefits and drawbacks of caching, as well as going through a couple of examples, and it's that example that we're going to be building on today. So this video will talk around how to invalidate or refresh the cache. And to do this, we focus on two different approaches. There's a quick and easy approach, which is useful for development and test environments, and a more robust approach for things like UAT and production. So let's get started with the quick and easy approach. So this approach uses a custom workflow activity, which has been built to access the cache using the instance and then reset the values. So this could be emptying a list or setting the values to null. So this is triggered from a workflow, so it could be configured to refresh automatically on the change of something, or used on demand for, say, testing or development purposes. This approach is only really suitable for environments with a single front-end or back-end server. So the reason we can't use this approach in a more scaled-out environment for UAT or production relates back to the previous video when we touched on the topic of caches being server-specific. So let's say we have this example. I have two CRM servers, each with their own copy of the cache. When we trigger our workflow, it's going to route to one of these servers and clear the cache on that one, but not both. Now, we could trigger the workflow multiple times, but we really have no guarantee that it's going to consistently refresh the cache. So the benefits of this approach is that it's simple to implement and can be triggered on demand, but the drawback is that it doesn't work on environments with multiple servers. So for that purpose, let's talk about a more robust approach. So this approach uses a custom entity within Dynamic CRM to maintain some kind of state value for the cache. This could be a date from which the cache was last updated or some kind of version number. It doesn't really matter as long as it's unique and can be easily changed. So what we do is we keep a copy of this value locally in our cache, and when the plugin executes, we get the value held in CRM and compare it to our local value. If it matches, then we use our cache, and if it doesn't, we clear the cache and get new data. It's fairly simple. So I've put together a quick diagram here so you can see what's going on. So in the first example, we trigger our plugin and we get the values from CRM. And if they're both the same, then we follow the blue path here and we use the items in the cache. But if the values are different, we instead follow this path and clear the cache and get new data. So the benefits of this approach is that it can be used to consistently clear the cache by changing a value in CRM, either manually or through a workflow. And it's entirely in CRM, so you don't need an IIS reset, for example. The drawback is that we are now calling CRM on each execution, so a judgment call needs to be made as to whether it's more performant to use the cache or just get the data from CRM. There are additional ways in which this can be improved, for example, saying that we'll only check every 10 minutes to see if the cache has been refreshed. It's really dependent on what you're trying to build and the requirements of your project, so use your best judgment. So what we're going to do now is look through an example of how to implement this approach using the code from the last video, which can be found in the description below. So what you can see now on screen is Visual Studio with the user cache open that we made in the last video. I've made a few amendments to support this new cache resetting that we're working on now. So we have this date and time, which will store the value that's held in CRM as to when the cache was last reset. We have a GUID, which we'll be using to provide some caching so we don't have to do lots of retrieve multiples, and I'll show you how that works in a second. And then we also have this constant variable here, which is just storing the name of our user cache, and I'll show you how that works in a second. So what I've also done, just down here, is created two new functions. One of them is called reset cache, and this is public, so if in a plugin, for example, we need to reset this cache for some reason, we can access it. And all this is doing is setting our users dictionary here back to a new instance. Very simple. And then we have the slightly more complicated function here of check cache validity, which we'll be calling every time we need to access the cache. And what this does is it checks to see if we've already got the record before, so our cache record that's held in CRM using the ID variable. If we haven't ever used this cache report, or it's the first time a plugin's running after an IIS reset, for example, then what it will do, it will go off to CRM and it will find this particular entity here that I've created called JD_cache, and it will retrieve the date that record was last refreshed. We're going to be putting a filter on this query to say get with the name, and this is where this cache record's name comes from, and that's our constant that we've got up in the top of the file called user cache, and I'll show you where that's set in CRM. And then we actually perform our retrieve multiple. Now what we do is we check to see if any records come back with this name. If we've got one, then great. We set the ID, we set the date that it was last refreshed to the value held in CRM, and then we perform our reset cache. If we don't get any records back at this point, this just falls out the bottom of this function and the cache operates much as it did before. So if we forget to set the record up in CRM, or we just want to run with normal caching without having to reset, then this will just fall through and it will maintain the cache as before. So in this second part, in this else statement here, so if we have got this record before, what we'll do is actually perform a retrieve, which is a lot more performant than a retrieve multiple, getting exactly the same information back, so we're getting our date last refreshed. If this record still exists, then we will get the date out of this record, and if the date isn't equal to our date that we're storing actually in our cache, then we will set up the new value and reset the cache. So the last thing we need to do is to implement this cache validity check is actually go back to our getUser function here, and before doing anything, let's go this.check cache validity and pass in our service. So now every time that we call our getUser function from our plugin, it's going to check and make sure that we are using the latest version of the cache using this this function down here. So actually within CRM, I've set up that entity that we saw in our cache called jd_cache, and given it a friendly name of cache settings. This is owned by the organization, so it doesn't have to have a particular user within the system, so everyone can access it given the right permissions. I've disabled all of the various other bits and bobs because we don't need those, and I've set up the name of jd_name. In addition to that, if we just go through here, I've set up the date last refreshed as a date and time field. And if we actually look at an example record here, you can see that I've got set the name to user cache, which is the one that we're using actually within our cache, and that's the constant value that you saw. And then we can see here the date that this was last refreshed, and I've just set this to an example value for now. And we also have a workflow set up to trigger whenever we need it to. So I've set this reset cache workflow up, and this is currently an on-demand workflow, and all that does is set that date time field to the execution time of our particular workflow. So that's our cache setup. This will work as we described in the presentation earlier. So it will go off and check CRM to see if the cache has been reset every single time that this plugin executes. As I said before, you can actually make this more performant by, say, only checking every 10 minutes if the cache has been changed in CRM. If you did want to do this, then what you should do is set up a variable here. So I've called mine time last checked. And essentially that is the time that we last went to CRM and checked if the cache had been reset. And then back down here in your cache check validity, we check to see if that value is null, if it's like the first time that this is being executed, or that 10 minutes has passed since we last checked. We're doing that greater than the time now. If we do execute this piece of code, then we need to set up the date time now. So to say we are checking now. And then it just runs the code. So if both of these are false, then we won't actually go through and check anything here. So that's just a little bit of a more performant way of doing things. However, you will have the 10-minute lag behind your cache. So again, it's completely up to you in terms of the project that you're working on and how things are going to work for you. So that's everything I wanted to cover in this video. If you've got any questions or noticed something that I've done wrong here, then please leave a comment, like if you like, and I will see you in the next video.